welcome to all and every one of you for coming and seeing this exhibition of my work, which is basically, you're seeing my life. It starts from the beginning in Salzheim near Frankfurt. And there are pictures here that were done as recently. This, for example, the original image for this was done in the fall of 1975. But the concept of this set of pictures was actually done just 2 or 3 days before the show opened in May of 2023 at the Photo Forum in Frankfurt, where Selina Lunsford curated this exhibition. And then it got expanded by Isabel Sieben here in Munich. So originally it was maybe 160 photographs, and Selina had come to my studio in Cleveland and selected maybe 650 of them. And out of those, we edited thinner and thinner and tighter, and finally got to about 185 pictures, which were shipped over to Germany. And then because there were some other pictures still in Frankfurt, this iteration of the show was the size it is, which is over 200 pictures. Starting about 1964, I began my undergraduate studies in literature at Northwestern University near Chicago in Evanston. And at the beginning, I took quite a few courses in acting, and I thought that was going to be my direction. So this photograph was done with the help of a friend in the south side of Chicago. And at this point, the thought of photography as a way to move through life had really not entered my universe in any way at all. But this is a section in Chicago on the south side that's thought of as a very rough place to go. And so, you know, being 21 years old, you want to go to all the places you're not supposed to go. And I feel in some ways that the way I've approached photography and life is whatever someone tells you to do, always do the opposite. Always go against the grain, always go against the expectation. And somehow, by not following the rules, I have made little tiny scratches on the wall of photography. So this particular photograph, which was done in Indiana, probably in the spring of 1971, and you can still see that it's late winter, early spring, it's probably late March, early April, was done while I was living at Minor White's house and was doing a workshop there. And when I brought this picture up in front of the other students, Minor went into a more than half-hour discussion explaining that this barn and the few things that were already outside of the barn was just a precursor of the place that held all my future treasures. And in the course of my life, these treasures would slowly be coming out of there. And as I heard him talk, I was going like, how does he know these things? And what bullshit this is. But somehow, now that 54 years have gone by, this was 1 year after I started at Miners in 1971. So much of what he said on that day has come to be true. So this is a photograph of the actor Jack Lemmon, and it was done in 1996 for the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung magazine when he was to get a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Berlin Film Festival. So a few months before that event, I was going out to Los Angeles to photograph him in what I knew was going to be an all-white room. And so the week before, I spent watching a number of his movies with my then 3-year-old son, who's now 31 years old. And as I'm watching these movies, I'm thinking, what is it about each film in terms of props that I can bring to my shoot that will somehow speak to who this phenomenal actor is. So in a movie called The Apartment, for example, he makes a pasta dinner for his partner, Shirley MacLaine, also an actress, who a few years later I photographed for the same reason. She was getting a Lifetime Award a few years after from Berlin Film Festival. And in that particular scene, Jack makes her pasta and then realizes he has no dish to put the water out. So he goes into his closet and he brings out a tennis racket and he puts the pasta in the tennis racket to get the water out of the pot. There's another scene in a movie called Mr. Roberts where Jack plays a sea captain, and he's in a big boat, and the big boat comes near a little boat, and in the little boat there's all these women in their bikinis sunbathing, and Jack gets out his binoculars because he wants a better look. So he's looking at that, and you know, a number of other references. I just brought props, and so I brought this yellow sweatshirt, I brought the hat, and then as we started talking, I said, Mr. Lemon, I'm always trying things that could be so far out that you're welcome to say no, but one of the things I did this morning is I had my assistant go to the most expensive grocery store in Hollywood and buy lemons. And they bought a dozen of these lemons, and I know FAZ is going to be in shock at how much these cost, but I'm hoping that you will play with me. And I went through and explained the scene in Mr. Roberts. And Jack turns to me and he says, you know, I've been an actor now for 55 years. And in all this time, photographers have always come and done my picture to promote whatever new production I was in. Not a single photographer has ever brought lemons. You can do whatever the hell you want. In 1986, I was getting very regular assignments from the FAZ magazine, and one of them was this photographer named Ilse Bing. And of course, everybody knew her self-portrait that she had done in Paris in 1931. She was born in Frankfurt in 1899, and she left to go to Paris about 1928, 29, and then very quickly became known in Paris as the Queen of the Leica. And so when I got to her place, one of the first pictures I made, which is not here but is on the cover, it's Ilse with her dog looking at the age of 86 like a 29-year-old fashion model. She was just so sure of herself. And I kept saying to that the real picture I wanted to do was this one, which was a retake of her famous picture, which is here. So once we did the first picture, I made it seem like this just came out of thin air, which it hadn't. And I said, Ilse, I wonder if we could redo that picture now. And she says, you know, I have a little surprise for you. And she had the button that she used in the first picture from 1931. She had kept it all these years, and she went and put it on, and we put gels and color. She loved this story so much, we became very close friends. And I was friends with her and her husband. And then for a number of years, I also did a lot of printing from her negatives. And I learned so much from this amazing photographer who happened to have been born in the same city as me, Frankfurt. Zwei Frankfurter. It should be clear that I'm not only a photographer when I have assignments, I'm a photographer wherever I am. And this was during travels in San Francisco to visit friends. And we had gone to a bookstore called City Lights. In the alleyway beside where the store is in San Francisco, there's this wonderful mural of Arthur Rimbaud. And my title for this is A Nutzi's Eye, which is the name of the construction company that obviously was doing some of the cleaning work on the street. And it turned out to be some kind of iconic image for me, with this incredible light falling on the staircase going above this, and a little part of a section of this Rimbaud portrait that somebody had painted as a mural, and this wonderful enigmatic eye down at the bottom. So the picture is called A Nutzi's Eye. It's from 1995. And I just came up with the name of the guy. It's Ferlinghetti. And he lived to be 102 years old, and he kept working in the store till a few weeks before he passed away. And he was writing poems 60 years, 70 years earlier than that, and was good friends with Allen Ginsberg and with William Burroughs and with Gary Snyder and with all the beat poets. In 1984, in June, I was still living in Cleveland just before moving to New York in October. And Cindy Sherman was having her first American retrospective at a museum not far from Cleveland called the Akron Museum of Art. And the curator there invited me to come and take pictures of her. And before coming to take pictures of her, I had studied a catalog that was done here in Munich by Lothar Schirmer. Schirmer Mosel produced it. And as I studied the pictures of her, what I realized is Cindy Sherman is very, very shy. And so what I brought with me was two masks, a white mask and a black mask. And down at the far end, there's a picture of her with the white mask with one of her very large photographs. What then happened is after I moved to New York, at some point, I was asked by Vanity Fair, the magazine, to photograph Cindy because that show that had started in Cleveland for her first American show, exhibition, had moved to a number of other museums, and that summer was coming to the Whitney Museum of American Art. And because Cindy was still very unknown in America, Vanity Fair did not ask Annie Leibovitz to photograph her, but they asked an unknown photographer to photograph an unknown artist. Relatively unknown Cindy and relatively unknown Abe in '87 got the assignment, and because we'd already worked together in Akron, she was very open and gave me lots of time, and gave me time even to do another story for the FAZ, which eventually ran pictures by Cindy in the thing and gave her lots of visibility. So this blow up is something I did in Photoshop as a combination of a portrait of her and something I found on the walls in Brooklyn that got all put together into this very large image now. So in 1970, when I just started taking pictures, and before I met Minor White, I was in Cleveland, and I had access to a darkroom at Case University, Case Western Reserve University. And I started working for their newspaper. And on the 3rd of November, one of the assignments I had was to go photograph Jane Fonda, who was coming to speak against the Vietnam War. And so I, having not learned anything about how photographs should be done, I was standing this close to her as she was talking, and was able to make this picture, among many others, of Jane being totally against the war in Vietnam. And it became so visible in town as she did this little talk at the university that a few hours later, the Cleveland police came and arrested her for talking against the war. And it happened to be on the same day, because if you Google Jane Fonda, Cleveland arrest, it's November 3rd. And she has her numbers on her chest. And she's very proud of the fact that the Cleveland police came and arrested her in a country that's supposed to have free speech. I mean, she's this obviously very talented actress and very intelligent person. And so her notion was, let's rock the boat as much as we can. And she spent her life doing that, and still in her 80s, she's still rocking the boat. This particular print of the Rolling Stones, which was done in 1997 at the launch of their Bridges of Babylon tour, was made by a collector here in Munich, and was sold by the dealer, Hubertus Reigers, who was handling my work in the late 90s and early 2000s. So the picture itself was made in a situation which is very different than what I usually work in, because I am probably about at least 20 meters away from these guys. They had announced that they were coming to New York. They had closed the Brooklyn Bridge, and Mick drove, oh, I guess it's in another picture, but he drove this convertible Cadillac, red convertible Cadillac, over the bridge with no other cars on it. And a helicopter had filmed them as they were coming in from Manhattan and into Brooklyn, and then down to be under the Brooklyn Bridge near a famous restaurant called The Bridge, I think. So there must have been 2,000 photographers. And in order to make this picture, even though usually I photograph people from a meter away or less, suddenly I was 20 meters away. I had a 300 millimeter lens on a tripod, and I did the best I could under the circumstances that I was surrounded by nothing but really great photographers, paparazzi guys and news guys and people interested in rock and roll and so on. But it became a picture out of a series of pictures that somehow had some validity and valence. And I'm very happy that this very large print from a local collection is in the exhibition, as well as the even larger print when you first walk into the show. And the Rolling Stones are one of my all-time favorite groups of musicians. In January of 1985, after I had only been in New York City for about 4 months, friends of my wife introduced me to the art director from FAZ named Hans-Georg Pospischil. And we had a wonderful lunch on Columbus Avenue. And as we started talking and I was showing him pictures, he said, you know, I would like you to work for us. And I said, wonderful. And he brings out a list. And on the list is a number of stories that they have in mind that they want to do. And at the very top of the list is the name Charles Bukowski. And he says, you know, for 6 years we have been trying to do this story, and every time we send a photographer or every time we make a request, he hangs up the phone, he's thrown photographers down the stairs, and we get nowhere. And I said, well, by coincidence, a really good friend of mine, who is a book and art dealer, helped his publisher, John Martin, at Black Sparrow Press, at a moment where they were going to go out of business. He bought everything they had, and they got started again. So what I know is Bukowski and his publisher owe a big favor to my friend. So I call my friend, Arthur Feldman. I call my friend Arthur, and I tell him the story that these friends want to do a story about Bukowski. And I says, can you help me get in the door? And he says, I don't know, let me see what I can do. So he calls up the publisher, who calls up Bukowski. He calls me back within 5 minutes. He says, here's the number, you're in. So I went, oh, fantastic. So I go out to California, and it's just myself, some cameras, some color film, some black and white film. And for 2.5 days, Bukowski and I are sitting and drinking and laughing and making pictures and having a wonderful time. And I'm thinking, I've got a story. So I send the story back to Germany when I get back to New York, and I get no answer. After a week, after 10 days, nothing. So I finally called them, and I said, so did you get my pictures? And they say, yes. Hans-Georg says, I did, but I won't talk to you on the phone. I'm coming to New York about something else, and we get together. So we make an appointment at a wonderful hotel called the Algonquin, and at 9 in the morning, I'm waiting for Hans-Georg to come down the stairs, and he comes down the stairs with my little manila envelope with all my pictures, and he throws it on the floor, and he says, Scheisse, And I knew at that moment this was definitely not a good response. But he sits me down and he starts giving me this wonderful lecture that completely changed my life. And it was a lecture about the fact that the magazine that his company puts out every Friday is this wonderful island that people can go to get them away from the daily news, which is all noise and chaos. And they want to go to this peaceful island to get away from all this. He says, the pictures you sent us, they're photographically fine, but they're just information. They're just not enough. What you need to do is make images of the mythos of this man. You need to make the pictures that will define him for 10 years before you got there and continue to define him at least for 10 years after you leave. And I said to Hans-Georg, how can I do that? He says, that's your problem. And he says, on top of that, when people look at a magazine, they open a page and they maybe look at each picture for 1/4 of a second. Your job is to make them look at your pictures for at least a half a second. And that'll be the beginning of their connection to the story, and they'll want to go deeper. So my next biggest obstacle was to call Bukowski, who I'd had such a good time. We both were born in Germany. We had all this common ground. We had been drinking together and had a, real connection. And I said, Hank, it's Abe. And you're not going to believe it, but they want more pictures. And he goes, more pictures? We gave them enough pictures to do 20 stories. We were shooting for 3.5 days. What is wrong with them? And I started to explain everything, and I finally said, listen, Bukowski, here's the story. If I don't make these pictures again, I probably won't eat for the rest of my life. I will have no roof over my head, and it'll be your fucking fault. So I'm coming out whether you like it or not. You give me a date, and it's done, and we'll do it again. So he says, all right, punk. And he gives me a date, 10 o'clock, Tuesday morning, 2 weeks, you be there. So 2 weeks go by. I practiced with a lighting guy and with all kinds of equipment. And we arrive and knock on his door. And Bukowski opens the door, and he goes, who the fuck are you? And I know he's pulling my leg. And he says, I'm still a little drunk from last night. Give me a couple of hours. You go set up everything, and I'll be ready. So then 2 hours later, he comes down, and his hair is all wet from the shower, and he's got a T-shirt on, and he tears the T-shirt, and he holds out a big knife, and he holds it in front of my face. He says, is this what these fucking krauts want? And I said, perfect, we're shooting. And so that completely changed the way I approached photography for magazines. You needed a level deeper than just information. So this is the fall of 1975, and I'm at a place called Rappaport Printing in New York City on Hudson Street. And simultaneous with my being there, printing my first book called Figments, is Joseph Kudelka, who's printing his first book called Gypsies. And so it really felt like two fathers at the maternity ward with their first babies, because we were both nervous and looking forward to how this would come into the world. And so we happened to be hanging out together for a number of days as they were doing one plate after another of these two books. And we basically got to hang out. I can't say I became friends with Joseph Kudelka, but we were in a similar situation, and I made this picture of him among maybe 3 or 4. He was very, he never stopped moving. And he's obviously a really brilliant photographer. So this is in the book Penelope's Hungry Eyes, which is portraits of photographers done here by Shermer Mosel in 2011. When I had a studio in New York, it was on 20th Street between Broadway and Park. And one of my neighbors, maybe within 300 meters, was the photographer Dwayne Michaels, and we got to be friends. And he would sometimes come to the studio, and I would sometimes go to his place. And at some point, I asked him to write something for, I think for an article, maybe in L'Œil de la Photo. And he wrote this very funny poem, which he calls Honest Abe Frajndlich, How the Cleveland Kid Photographs Icons with His Nikon. So part of what you need to know is that Dwayne grew up in Pittsburgh, which is a city not very far from Cleveland. And his roots in Pittsburgh was he came from a very poor family, and he was neighbors with Andy Warhol, who was a good buddy of his. And Dwayne did many pictures of a younger Dwayne when he first got to New York. So because these cities are all close to each other, because they're sort of looked down upon by New Yorkers or Los Angelinos or even Philadelphians, Dwayne and I had this common bond of humor about our roots. Even though I wasn't born in Cleveland, I grew up there. So he says, how the Cleveland kid photographs icons with his Nikon. What do you do when you see Irving Penn peering back at you through your lens? I'd panic and then practice Zen. What do you do when Cartier-Bresson shouts as you shoot, "Get out of my way, be gone," and hits you on the head? I'd be frantic and play dead. And when you ask Annie to sit in a chair and suddenly your camera is flying midair because La Leibowitz has thrown a fit, I'd quit in despair. But not Frajndlich. The Cleveland kid is very brave and has a trick or two up his sleeve. Anyone who can turn a lemon into Jack Lemonade is a photo alchemist. The rumors of Abe's humor are true. He has the light touch of a jewel thief who can steal your face sans grief. He sees what others only notice, and in a flash, alakazam, it's "thank you, ma'am." How does he do it? Frajndlich mesmerizes with chit-chat, distracts with catty gossip, slips them martinis, then stuffs them with blinis. He shoots away until they say, "Uncle, are we through already? Can I go now?" The Cleveland kid is haute couture, not prêt-à-porter. Each portrait is not so much a reproduction of the sitter's face, but rather an expression of the subject vis-a-vis his poetry. Insight is Abe's secret. Understanding rather than mere observation is what defines him as a photographer. To be Frajndlichized is to be immortalized. And that is all I have to say. Dwayne Michaels in 2012. Thank you, Dwayne. So kind. In the fall of 1970, not long after I had made that picture of Jane Fonda, a man named Minor White, who was the head of photography at MIT, was coming to Cleveland to do a 3-day workshop. And I went to the workshop. I had been doing photographs for about 5 months, and he was somebody that I was very keen, very interested in meeting, because he had started the magazine Aperture, and he had been this very influential teacher at this point for more than 35 years. So I went to the workshop, and on the second day, I got my nerve up to say to this man, "Will you look at my work?" And he said, "Sure." And he asked me to come to where he was staying, and he went through my work, and he said, "Well, this is mostly shit, but if you like, you can come and study at my house." And he had something called a live-in workshop where 3-4 people a year would come to his house and study photography in a very close way. At the same time, he was teaching photography at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. And so after doing a little questioning about who he really was, a week later, I hitchhiked to Boston and started my photographic life. And my very first assignment by Minor when I got there was to organize his library. And in doing that, for the first time, I began to realize photography too, not just literature, which I had studied, has this remarkable history. And unlike literature, which starts thousands of years back, photography at that point started only less than 150 years back. And I thought, somehow with this medium, maybe I can make a little scratch and leave a tiny mark. And so that was my ambition, and Miner helped me get that started. In very early 1994, I think it was in February, I was asked by British Elle magazine to go and photograph Yoko Ono. And the one thing I had learned about her from reading was that she sometimes was a very difficult subject. By coincidence, a good friend of mine was friends with Yoko and also friends with John, and she had done some films about the two of them together and had done a big interview on John for Rolling Stone. And so I called my friend Barbara, and I said, Barbara, please do me a favor. Can you call Yoko Ono, because I got to take a picture of her and a big story, and could you just ask her to be nice to me? So she calls Yoko and says, my friend Abe is coming to photograph you. Please be nice to him. So myself and an assistant arrive at Yoko's place, and she gave us 5 hours of her time, and she could not have been nicer. She made us lunch. She was drawing calligraphy on the floor. She went out into the park with us with her bodyguard and showed us all the private areas in this huge New York apartment at the Dakota, and could not have been nicer. So fast forward after I send all these pictures to British Elle, and they first come back to me and say they really like them. At the end of the day, because Yoko is not well liked in England because they all think she broke up the Beatles, they never even ran the story. And I got, I had control of all the pictures. They all came back to me. So it's unfortunate in terms of her relationship with the British press, which on the one hand, they're fascinated by her and they can't get enough of her. And on the other hand, all those years later, they still were blaming her for breaking up the Beatles. So that's life in the journalistic world. When I first arrived at Minor White's house in the fall of 1970, the first job he gave me was to organize his photo library. And every night I would take books up to my room and I would fall asleep looking at these amazing pictures. And what immediately struck me about these pictures, some of which were quite well known, is that as known as the photographs were, nobody knew the people who made the photographs. They were anonymous. And somewhere almost starting at that point was the notion that maybe something I could explore was making pictures of the people who are always behind the lens, who are always anonymous, who you never know who made the picture. So through Minor, I met Imogene Cunningham. I photographed her. Later, I met Ansel Adams, but didn't photograph him until many years later. And eventually, when I moved to New York, I got an assignment from Life magazine in 1988 to photograph the grandes dames of photography. So it was all the great ladies. It was Bernice Abbott. It was Ruth Bernhard. At any rate, as we were doing all these great ladies, I went to the art director, Peter Howe, and I said, listen, Peter, I think we're doing reverse sexism because a lot of the great boys are still around. Why are we just concentrating only on the ladies? And he said, fine. So he sends me to Mexico to photograph Bravo, who is right here. He sends me to photograph Aaron Siskin up in Rhode Island. He sends me down to Atlanta to photograph Harry Callahan. And they run a small edition in the 150th anniversary of photography. They run a story that runs for 7 pages and includes a number of these portraits. And at that time, I am connected with an agency called Sigma. And Sigma at that time is very close to the people at Kodak. And Kodak sees the story, and they come to me and they say, how would you like to go around the world and photograph any photographers you like, and we'll take care of it? And I said, what kind of a question is that? That's like a dream job. And that's how it started. For 2.5 years, they sent me to Japan, to Europe, to Latin America to photograph the great masters of photography. And in the book that Shermer Mosel then does in 2011, there's 101 photographers, even though I had photographed probably 160 of them. It was a big edit job. And in 1990, this was a major exhibition in Photokina in Cologne. And it ran, I believe, from October 1990 for about 3 months maybe at that point. And then it traveled around Germany to museums until 1997. So these are pictures from that original exhibition and that original set of pictures. And what's really remarkable is when Kodak first started printing these, they were printing them as dye transfer prints through a printer in Hamburg. And doing dyes, you have to make an edition of at least 15 pictures. And Kodak began to realize this was going to get seriously expensive. So they created this paper specifically for this project that had a lot of the properties of the dye transfer. It had this very rich, saturated color, and it had this incredible shelf life, because these prints were made in 1989 and 1990, 23 and 24 years ago, and they look like they were printed yesterday. So Kodak really went to bat, and they produced 4 sets of these pictures. And 2 sets came to Europe to travel around, 2 sets came to me, and I'm still in shock at the quality of these things that have never sort of lost their incredible luminescence. So Kodak was more than kind to me, and thank you, Kodak gods. The history of American photography is such that its parameters are expressed by practitioners who feel that if they just bring a camera to a site and push the button and open the image to the world, they've done enough. And to me, all that renders is information that's in front of the camera. When I started this series called Site-Specific Investigations of a Glove, what I was trying to contend with is the fact that making a picture involves bringing other levels of both meaning and information and entry than just what's in front of the lens. And the glove became a way of bringing this other level of intellect into the problem of making pictures, because it's never simple. It's never just pushing the button. It's always about getting to other layers and other dimensions that if the picture is going to last at all, it needs to get the viewer involved enough to want to ask those other levels of questions. And that's what this whole series was about. It was about making pictures that weren't just the easy American history pictures. American photography is filled with photographers who just go somewhere and spend 15 years photographing the same house over and over again, and the same street and the same dog. And at the end of the day, there's very little there. And so I tried to open the door a little further to say there's more to photography than information about dogs and streets and sunsets. In all these 54 years of making pictures, the one subject that I've kept coming back to again and again and again is the female body. And at some point in 1999, Umschau Braus did a wonderful book of my nudes called Eros Eterna. This picture here was done in early 1970, just as I was starting to make pictures. And this woman's name is Jennifer Jones. 3 weeks before this picture was done, she had given birth to her 4th child. And she was totally into Zen meditation and yoga. And I began to realize that this as a subject was going to be central to whatever I did going forward in photography. And it was one of these just throwaway pictures, you know. I said, hey, let's make some pictures. And she was totally relaxed about it. She was this hippie mom with 4 kids with 3 different fathers. And I was living in a house with another hippie mother who had 5 kids, also with 3 different fathers. So, you know, it was 1970. It was the height of free love and freedoms of complete expression. And it was sort of the atmosphere that I got started in. And so this was a subject matter that always was very close to my heart. And I've continued to explore it. This particular photograph was done in October of 1970. Before I met Miner, I one evening went for a ride in the countryside near Cleveland with a friend. And it was quite a dark night, and it was quite foggy. And I remember I was using 2475 recording film, which is this very fast 1600 ASA film. And I set up a tripod, and I asked, once I saw the shadow on, this is a church back door. Once I saw the shadow, I said, please take a picture of me. And my friend did, pushed the button. And years later, when this picture was shown just last year in Frankfurt, Selena suddenly said, oh, this is a wonderful picture. I always thought it was an okay picture. But she made it into a bigger picture. And then Isabel made it an even bigger picture. So this sort of very offhand thing that happened one evening in 1970 from just a simple ride in the country has turned into a kind of iconic self-portrait with the shadow. And somebody who was here just a few hours ago made this observation that the shadow almost looks like it's a feminine shadow, which I hadn't seen before, but whatever is seen by somebody is their interpretation, so it's all good. So in this room, we have pictures of 2 of my very special muses in my life. The first one being Rosebud Conway, that I lived with from 1972 to 1974 and photographed almost incessantly in the series that became my first book, Figments, and also lots of nude pictures of her. And the second muse in this room is a woman named Minami Atsu from Tokyo, who does Buto dance. And coincidentally, Rosebud died on June 14th of 1978. And 10 days later in Japan, Minami Atsu was born. And I had the privilege of meeting Minami in New York in 2008. And she was performing in a subway station. And I made a few little pictures. And because I didn't speak Japanese and she didn't speak English, I gave her my email address. And I said, I will send you pictures if you send me a note. And she did. And a year later, I went to Tokyo to photograph Nobuyoshi Araki and Shinoyama, 2 of the great Japanese photographers. And while I was there, I did a couple of photographic sessions with Minami. And she was so in the moment, and the pictures sort of shocked me at the level of her connection with me that I started bringing her to New York the next year in 2010. And I brought her to Italy to do a workshop, and we traveled around for 3 weeks. And eventually I brought her to Cleveland, where I moved to, and she came to Frankfurt and did a performance when this show opened there at the Photo Forum. And these women have been integral to my photographic development and my sort of emotional development, in terms of having met one very early and having met one and worked with one now for more than 15 years in the present. And so I feel they have been major, major figures and influencers on my own, not just photographic development, but emotional and spiritual evolution. And I can't thank both of them enough.